The first thing she noticed was the frost creeping up inside her neighbor's windows. It was just the second week of November, and already the deep freeze had started swallowing the valley below. Every chimney in sight spewed smoke like they were desperate to stay ahead of death. Children in 3 different cabins were kept home from school sick with coughs. The McClellan baby hadn't stopped crying in 2 days because her blanket kept icing over. Firewood piles were already low, and a few of the men had begun cutting trees they'd sworn were too green to burn. And still, from her porch, elevated 9 full feet off the ground and held on thick stilts of treated pine, Martha Winslow stood barefoot. Steam curled gently from her stovepipe. No frantic belching, no frantic chopping. The cabin around her glowed faintly through the windows. Not one log in her pile had been touched since the cold first rolled in. The town had laughed when she built it up so high. Now they stared from their doorways in silence. Not one of them understood why her cabin stayed so warm, but Martha did, and she'd learned the hard way. The whole thing started the day after her husband was lowered into the frozen earth. They buried him early that year, first week of February, and had to burn a whole barrel of precious lamp oil just to thaw the gravesite long enough for the shovel to go in. The wind at his burial nearly snapped her bonnet from her head. Every widow knows the way cold sinks into the bones when grief has cracked you open. But this wind clawed like it meant to take her with him. Like the earth wasn't satisfied with just the man. She had 2 choices: flee back east to her brother, tired with nothing but the clothes on her back and a 4-day train ride she couldn't afford, or build something with what was left. The banker, Mr. Weldon, gave her a week to vacate the property. Her husband's debts had been rolled up in the title to the cabin, and the land had never fully transferred to her name. She didn't argue. She knew the law, and no man in town had reason to stick his neck out for a half-frozen widow with a broken roof and a larder that hadn't been stocked since the fall before last. But she had something else, something no one bothered to ask about: the design. It had come to her not in a dream, but in a mistake. 3 winters prior, they'd stayed for a week up on the ridge with a trapper named Elijah Stone. The man lived like a lunatic, built his shack on stilts, with ladders he pulled up each night, claiming it kept the mountain lions out. Her husband had laughed. "Ain't no cattle climb a roof when it can come through the wall." But Martha hadn't laughed, because she remembered how warm that cabin had stayed. Every morning she'd stepped out from under the heavy bearskin quilts and felt real warmth still trapped in the floorboards. Her breath didn't cloud up, her fingers didn't ache from cold. The wind never howled through the joints. The trapper had told them something odd while sipping his broth. "You build up high, the air moves better. Don't hold wet in the corners, and the frost don't grip your bones the same way." Her husband had rolled his eyes and gone back to his stew, but she remembered. Now her husband was dead, and the only thing she still had was that memory. She bought the lumber with what little silver she had left from her mother's earrings, hauled it herself in a borrowed wagon from the mill near Whitcomb's Creek. The men at the yard kept offering to help her plan something proper, but she refused. She had already drawn the design, on paper, in pencil, double-framed, single room, but with a twist, a vented subfloor space fully open to the air, with panels that slanted inward to guide the wind. The cabin would float 9 feet off the ground on a frame of thick posts, each one sunk deep and braced in stone, not soil. They said she was mad. "You want wind underneath your house?" laughed Mr. Yarlson. "You'll catch death through your floorboards," muttered a woman from church. "Widow's gone touched," said the grocer, and left the change a coin short without saying a word. But she didn't argue. She didn't explain. She built, alone. The first post went into the earth on April 17th. She marked the day because it snowed again that morning, and she remembered thinking, "Good, let them watch." She hammered the brackets herself using salvaged iron from her old stove. She dug the trenches by hand and lined each with rock and packed earth. She fell twice, once off a beam, bruising her ribs, and once in a hole she'd dug too deep, cracking a tooth she never got fixed. But she kept going. By June, the platform stood. By August, the cabin stood on top of it, and by the time the first freeze came down from the ridge, she'd already spent a week inside it without striking a match. Here's what she'd figured out. Not that she ever said so to anyone who asked, and only one man ever truly did. Heat wants to rise. Everyone knows that. But in most cabins, the frost creeps up from the dirt. The ground pulls warmth like a hungry mouth, sucking it from the soles of your boots and the floorboards you walk on. When it rains and then freezes, moisture pushes into the wood. Then the frost takes hold, and even if your stove's roaring, the cold wins. But when you build your cabin above the ground, when you let the air move under your home, it breaks the frost line. Not all the way, but enough. The cold air doesn't press straight up into your walls. The damp doesn't rot the base, and the floor stays warm as long as you know how to layer it. She'd sealed the underside with 2 layers of tightly spaced oak planks, a waxed cloth between them. The breeze that flowed below her home wasn't a curse. It was a barrier, and with a tight chimney, angled eaves, iron and inner walls framed in wool. She barely had to burn at all. It wasn't magic, just stubborn memory and careful hands. The first storm came on November 9th. It rolled in hard, no warning, dumping 2 feet overnight and freezing the creeks stiff. By dawn, the town was white and half the cabins were already sending children to fetch water before the wells froze over. Martha had watched it come from her window, arms crossed, listening to the ice tap against the outer panels of her home. She didn't light the stove. She didn't need to. The wind slid harmlessly beneath her, pushed out by the slanting underpanels. The wool-sealed floor kept the chill at bay, and the heat from the little bed stove she'd stoked the night before still lingered. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders more from habit than need, and then set out 2 slices of bread to toast near the coals. Below her, smoke poured frantic from every chimney in town. She didn't burn a stick that day. It was the blacksmith's daughter who finally broke the silence. She trudged up the slope just after noon, eyes red from the wind, her voice a quiet knock when she reached the stairs. Martha opened the door slow, still in her house slippers, and the girl stood shivering like she didn't know what to say. "Ma says you built wrong," she whispered, then blinked. "But Pa said you're still warm." Martha said nothing. The girl hesitated, then looked at the corner of the cabin, where the snow had drifted but hadn't stuck. "Is it true?" Martha just nodded once. Not smug, not cruel, just honest. The girl looked at her feet, then asked if she could sit a minute, just to stop shivering. Martha opened the door wider. That was the first visitor, but not the last. By December, 3 other families had started asking questions, quietly, awkwardly. At first they pretended it was something else. "Got any extra lamp oil? Mind if I borrow a cup of salt?" But each visit ended the same way, standing too long near her floor, glancing sideways at her stovepipe, which didn't smoke. They started asking. She still didn't explain much, just pointed to the ridge and said, "Watch the snow when the wind comes. See where it stays, see where it melts." She didn't know the town would turn, didn't expect what came next, because one man watched too closely, and he didn't come for warmth. He came for what he thought she'd hidden. His name was Judd Harrow, 43. Born just south of the ridge in a mining camp that never made it through its 3rd year. He walked with a limp from a horse fall and was missing part of his left index finger. Martha knew all this because she'd watched him for years without ever meaning to. Judd Harrow had a way of being wherever trouble started, but never where it ended. He wasn't the worst man in town, not by a long shot, but he had that look some men wear when they believe they're owed something from the world simply for having survived it. And now he wanted something from her. Not warmth, not kindness, not shelter. What he wanted was the secret. He knocked at dusk, 3 days after the 3rd snow, stood on her long stairs with both hands in his coat pockets, breath fogging in the cold. Martha had just finished stitching a patch on her wool curtain. She hadn't lit the lamp yet. The grey outside was enough for her to see him. She waited. "You plan on inviting me in?" he asked, voice too casual. "No," she replied. He smiled without humor. "Well, now that ain't neighborly." She stood in the doorway, blocking the warm air from escaping. "You need something?" Judd shifted slightly. "I figure I do. The whole town's got smoke pouring like it's war. And you're up here not even burning pine. You sitting on a coal seam, Martha? Or just got a trick stove no one's seen?" Her eyes didn't flinch. "I don't owe you answers." "No, ma'am," he said slowly. "You don't. But I got mouths to feed, same as you did before that man of yours kicked off. And I reckon if you know something that could keep my youngest from freezing, I've got a right to know it." She stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, and stared him down, without a shawl on her shoulders. Her silence said more than words ever could. Judd's mouth twitched. "So that's how it's gonna be." She waited. He looked down the hill, then back at her, jaw clenched like he was weighing something ugly. "I'll be back," he said finally. "Once you realize how foolish it is to keep secrets while folks suffer." She closed the door without a word. He didn't knock again that night, but he would return, and not alone. That week, the snow deepened. 2 more storms blew in, hard and fast, trapping smoke against the hills and burying wagons up to their axles. The mail was late. The ice cracked open the hinges on the schoolhouse door. Children coughed blood into rags. One man, Tobias Brandt, burned through 3 cords of wood in 6 days just to keep the chill from crawling up into his bed, and still lost 3 fingers to frostbite after falling asleep too near the outer wall. And through it all, Martha's cabin glowed like a lantern held above the storm. She never went into town, but they came to her. Mrs. Arms sent her eldest son with a pail and a note. The boy waited respectfully by the stairs. Martha gave him a jar of goose grease for the baby's chest and a wedge of rye bread, still warm. She didn't mention that it hadn't come from an oven, just a small skillet by the coals. She said nothing about the temperature inside. Old Man Dorsey tried to trade her a silver watch for just one look beneath the cabin. She refused gently. The schoolteacher stopped her on the trail one morning. Martha was going to cut dry grass in the low thicket for insulation, and offered her $2 if she'd draw a diagram. Martha shook her head. Fawn then handed her a small roll of muslin, unwaxed, and said, "Line the seams of your children's beds with this. It helps." None of these people threatened her. They came in need. They left quiet, but one didn't. It was the fourth storm, early December, when Judd Harrow came back. This time he wasn't alone. He brought 3 men with him. 2 carried lanterns. The third had a hatchet. Martha saw the glint of it from her loft window before the snow made it hard to see anything else. She had a rifle, not a good one. The firing pin needed cleaning, and the left eyelet on the sling was cracked, but it would shoot. She didn't take it down. Not yet. Instead, she walked out onto the porch with a single candle cupped in her hands, and waited as they climbed the long stairs slow, like wolves circling a barn. Judd stood at the front, boots crusted with ice, jaw set like a man who wanted to be talked out of something. "You know why we're here?" he said. "I know you brought tools," Martha replied, looking past him at the hatchet. One of the other men, Barnett, a hard-luck rancher with 4 children, shifted uneasily. "We ain't here to hurt you, Miss Winslow." Martha said nothing. "We just want to know how it works," said the third man, Peter Lowe, younger than the others, not quite hard yet. "Your stove, your whatever this is?" "There's no trick stove," Martha said. "Then what?" Judd asked, stepping forward. "You built some kind of furnace under there? Found a gas vein? Got contraptions under this thing?" "No furnace," she said quietly. "No magic, just design." Judd's face darkened. "Then show us." "No." He stepped closer. "You saying you'd let folks freeze?" "Oh, when you got answers." She didn't blink. "You came with a hatchet." Judd turned slightly. "It's for wood. If you weren't so busy sitting on secrets, maybe we wouldn't need to chop ours in the middle of the damn night." She held up the candle. It flickered gently, barely disturbed. "This is how still it is inside," she said. "No draft, no chill, no need for smoke. I don't burn more than a bundle a week, but I spent months getting it right, alone, with no help, while every man in town called me a fool." She pointed at the snow, piled high under her cabin, but never touching the base. "Your homes fight the earth. Mine uses the air. That's all." Barnett swallowed. "That's all?" She nodded once. Peter stared beneath the cabin, where the snow had drifted around the support beams but hadn't crept under. I think she's telling the truth," he said. Judd didn't move. "You don't get to hoard heat," he said flatly. "I'm not," she replied. "But I don't owe it to you either." He looked like he might lunge, but Peter stepped in front of him. "She told us what we came for," Peter said. "Ain't no crime in smarts. Ain't no miracle here, just work." Judd's lip curled. "You'll freeze, same as the rest of us, if you don't stop protecting her secrets." Peter didn't flinch. "Then maybe we should start building like her instead of threatening the one warm house left." The words hung there a moment. Then Judd turned without a word and stomped back down the stairs, the hatchet man following. Barnett lingered a second, eyes full of apologies he didn't know how to say, then followed. Peter stayed behind. He looked at her with something not quite admiration, not quite guilt. "Can I ask just one question?" She nodded. "Why so high off the ground?" She thought for a moment, then answered. "Because the wind doesn't just take heat, it also keeps the cold from settling. It moves. That's all I needed. Movement." He nodded slowly, then turned and left. Martha stood a long time in the doorway, not out of fear, but because for the first time she knew someone had listened. The cabin stayed warm all through December. She burned less than half a cord, used no oil. The other cabins began to change. One added a skirt around the base, thinking it would help. It trapped moisture and turned their floorboards to mush. Another dug out a trench beneath their hearth, trying to channel heat upward. It only funneled smoke back into the parlor, but 2 families began raising the floor in the spring. And one man came back, not for warmth, but for her. Because sometimes warmth doesn't come from stoves at all. Sometimes it rises from the quiet strength of a woman who doesn't flinch. By Christmas, the valley had gone grey and hollow. Not just the weather, but the people. You could see it in their eyes as they huddled at church, with soot still smudged on their cheeks, or in the way they wrapped their scarves too tight around their mouths when speaking. Whole conversations had shrunk to nods and small gestures. The cold silenced more than just the birds. In a dozen cabins, firewood stacks had already dropped below half. The snow hadn't stopped for more than 2 days at a time. When it melted, it froze harder. Every creek became a trap of jagged glass. Horses slipped, A boy cracked his skull trying to fetch a bucket from the stream that hadn't fully thawed. 2 families fled south altogether, packed up what they could fit on a sled, and left behind half their furniture to the ice. And still, Martha's cabin stayed warm. Above the ground, lifted on those thick cross-braced legs, her home held heat like a flask with the stopper sealed tight. But the warmth didn't just stay inside. It changed her. Something about warmth, true warmth, earned not granted, builds a quiet strength. Martha didn't set out to become a teacher, or an example, or any kind of pioneer. But by New Year's, there were 6 cabins, 6 that had asked her if she might just take a look, not for handouts, not for heat, but to understand, to see. She agreed to everyone. She never charged a penny. She went with her shawl and her sharp eyes, and a stub of charcoal in her coat pocket, in case she needed to sketch something out on a crate lid or cellar wall. She pointed to gaps in planking, to unsealed joints, to frost trails along the floor's edge. She asked questions no man had thought to ask, about air movement and how many people slept in which room, and where the draft came from after the stove cooled. Cold doesn't just come from outside, she'd say. It rises from the places we don't expect. Some scoffed, but others listened. A few cabins added inner walls with cloth-wrapped tar. One family took the table apart and built an insulated sleeping platform, just high enough to trap heat from the stove beneath. A widower named Jebry Carter used empty whiskey bottles to line a wall inside his bedroom, then painted them black to soak heat by day. Martha had told him she'd read of something similar once. He beamed like a boy. They were trying, they were learning, but not everyone was satisfied. Oh, Judd Harrow didn't come back, not with threats at least. But in his silence, there was something worse than anger. There was calculation. Martha saw him in town once in January, just past the general store, talking in low tones with Mr. Weldon, the banker who'd taken her old place. They stopped speaking when she passed. Neither smiled, neither tipped their hat. That night she nailed shut the crawl access to the underside of her cabin and oiled her rifle, not because she expected a break-in, but because men like Judd didn't come empty-handed a second time. The 3rd week of January, the wind shifted. It came down from the north with a pitch that screamed through every crack like a knife, freezing not just the air but the light. Even midday seemed to flicker like dusk, the kind of cold that made voices break mid-sentence and cows stagger on brittle hooves. That's when it started. The accusations. They didn't come all at once. First it was just whispers. She's got some trick buried under that cabin. Bet it ain't legal. Might be she's tapped into something unnatural. Then came the warnings in church. The preacher, normally a reasonable man, spoke of pride, of women stepping out of order, of the dangers of private knowledge kept in defiance of community good. His words weren't loud, but they were sharp, and they were aimed like nails. Martha didn't flinch. She just started leaving food by her porch each week, wrapped, unmarked, for anyone who needed it. She never saw who took it, but it was never there in the morning. That was the season when people began building strange things in desperate haste. One man dug a trench to bury pipes under his floor. The ground froze solid before he could seal them, and the frost backed up into his walls. Another tried to raise his entire cabin on stones overnight, believing the elevation alone would do the trick. The supports cracked. The building tilted. They had to sleep in the barn until spring, and in the center of it all stood Martha's home, steady, quiet, unchanged. One of the only cabins without smoke choking the sky. It began to scare them, not because of what it was, but because it worked, and they didn't understand. The breaking point came on February 3rd. 3 children had gone sick, their lungs filled with frost-scraped breath. Mrs. Alms came begging for a blanket Martha didn't have to spare. Martha gave her her own. Later that night, someone tried to burn her house down. They poured lamp oil under the stairs, lit it with a rag, but the snow took it before it could climb. The wind, channeled under the angled panels just like Martha had designed, sucked the fire back out and smothered it in the drifts below. All that remained by morning was a blackened patch of slush and a twisted rag clinging to the frost. Martha didn't tell the sheriff, didn't ask questions, didn't name names, but that morning she went into town, not for vengeance, for wood. She bought a bundle of rough pine and dragged it up the hill herself, split it, stacked it outside, and on a board nailed to the side she carved 3 words, "Take if needed." Nothing more, nothing less. That's when something shifted, not with everyone, but with someone. Peter Lowe came first. He didn't knock, just stood under the porch, looking up like he meant to speak and couldn't find the words. Finally, he called out softly, "I'd like to build one, like yours." Martha looked down. "Why?" he shrugged. "Because next winter's coming, and I don't want to ask again." She invited him up. They talked for an hour. 2 weeks later, He laid his first post into the thawing ground, not as high, just 5 feet, but enough to break the frost line. A young couple followed, then a man with a bad leg, then the Carter boys, who asked if it was true wind could carry heat if you trapped it right. By March, 4 cabins stood on stilts. Not all perfect, not all warm, but trying. And one day, as she stepped onto her porch in the quiet melt of early spring, Martha saw something she hadn't expected. Judd Harrow. He stood alone, hat in hand. No anger, no threat, just a look of something she hadn't thought he was capable of. Shame. He said nothing. She said nothing. But after a while, she nodded once and walked back inside. Not because she forgave, but because winter had already passed judgment, and no man could outstare the truth. Spring did not come kindly. It arrived slow, like a reluctant apology, dropping snow one final time in mid-March, before the melt finally took hold. The valley didn't thaw so much as shed its skin in layers. First the roads, turning to sucking mud that swallowed wagon wheels to their hubs, then the roofs, sagging with wet weight that slid off in slabs loud enough to startle horses, and finally the earth itself, blooming with bitter weeds long before the first wildflowers dared return. Martha's cabin weathered it all like it had been born for it. No flooding, no rot. The underside stayed dry, the floor stayed warm, and the town, with quiet hands and bent shoulders, began to admit the truth. She hadn't been mad, she'd been ahead. By the first full week of April, Peter Lowe's elevated cabin was finished. He used scrap from his collapsed barn and doubled his cross-bracing on the advice of Martha. It stood 5 feet off the ground, with angled venting slats and an inner floor lined in pitch-sealed wool, stitched by his wife's careful hands. It wasn't perfect, but it held heat. When a late frost rolled in on the 9th, his chimney barely smoked, and folks noticed. Peter didn't gloat. He just did what Martha had done, answered questions, loaned sketches, helped a neighbor raise a beam when asked, and the quiet spread. The blacksmith began measuring for support posts. 2 more families came to Martha with hand-drawn plans. Someone sent her a sack of flour with a note pinned to it. For the woman who warmed us without fire. She never knew who, but she baked bread anyway, and wrapped 4 loaves to leave on porches that had no smoke rising. Even Mr. Weldon, the banker, changed his tone. He approached her in the store, hat in hand, voice like gravel. "Miss Winslow," he said, not meeting her eyes, "I've come to reckon I judged your construction method prematurely. I've written a letter to the county clerk. Your homestead's clear now, free and legal." She nodded, didn't thank him, just said, "It always should have been." He blinked once, then left without another word. But peace doesn't settle easy in places that spent months twisted in cold. Sometimes it just makes room for the next kind of storm, one that doesn't come from the sky. Late April brought an unexpected visitor, a man from Faircross, 3 towns over, named Hiram Dedge, thin, sharp-chinned, with a mouth too used to selling. He'd heard of the miracle widow who'd kept warm without fire and claimed to represent an investment consortium out of Missouri. Said he wanted to buy her design. "We'd make it easy," he said. "You sign a paper, we handle the rest. Mass production, royalties, maybe even patent it in your name." Martha didn't blink. "I never patented being warm, but people would pay for it. I didn't build it to sell." He tried a dozen angles. Appeals to pride, promises of comfort, even veiled warnings. "Someone else will figure it out eventually. Better you profit first." She showed him the door. He left in a huff, saying she was turning her back on progress. She didn't reply, but she did notice that night her stairs had been tampered with. One brace cracked, another loosened. She fixed them in silence and moved a chair in front of her rifle rack, just in case. The next week brought a different kind of pressure, this time from people she knew. Old Man Dorsey wanted her to teach a proper class on elevated home construction. Mrs. Arms suggested she run for council and make the town change its building code. Even Peter Lowe, kind as he was, asked her to at least name the method, so folks know who to credit when they copy it. Martha said no, not because she didn't care, but because names didn't matter. Warmth did, and she'd already shared everything that counted. The real trial didn't come until May. A hard rain arrived, sudden and brutal, soaking the thaw-softened valley and breaking what remained of several old cabins. 2 collapsed in the night. One family barely escaped before the roof caved in. The mud swallowed half a chicken coop and nearly took a wagon with it. But every elevated cabin stood, even the half-finished ones, even Peter's. Martha's cabin, high and dry, didn't creak, didn't sink, and finally the town understood what she had really built. Not just warmth, but resilience, the ability to outlast, to endure the unexpected, to bend but never break. The last man to test her came not with threats, but with grief. Judd Harrow knocked on her door on the first clear morning after the storm. He looked smaller, paler, his limp more pronounced. "My daughter," he said. She was in one of the collapsed cabins, didn't make it out. Martha didn't speak, just stepped aside. Let him sit. She poured water, listened. He said he didn't blame anyone, not even the carpenter who'd done the original build, not the town, not even her. But I should have listened, he said, voice raw. I should have built like you. I mocked what I didn't understand. I called it foolish, and it was the only thing that wasn't. She placed a hand on the table between them, left it there. He didn't take it, but he nodded. And for Judd Harrow, that was something like peace. By June, the hills bloomed, children played barefoot again, chickens returned to the yard, and for the first time in years, the town held a gathering that wasn't funeral, nor church, nor council. A picnic. Peter hosted it. Martha came but stood at the edge. She watched the children laugh, watched the men build new roof frames in the distance, watched the town change, not all at once, not entirely, but enough. And at dusk, as the sun dipped low behind her elevated cabin, casting long shadows across the newly braced frames of homes rising on fresh posts, Martha stood barefoot again, not because she needed to prove anything, but because the ground was warm now, and she had made it that way. The summer that followed was neither easy nor abundant, but it was kind. Kind in the way seasons only are after they've tried to kill you. The sun lingered longer. The rains came slow and gentle. Even the trees bore more fruit than usual, as if the land itself had been humbled by how close it had come to taking too much. The town, once split by old ways and whispered blame, bent towards something new. People shared, people asked, and most surprisingly of all, people built. By mid-July, no fewer than 11 new cabins stood on elevated posts. Some were modest, just a foot or two off the ground. Others dared higher. Peter Lowe had helped 3 of them with bracing. The Carter boys had started designing a hybrid system, mixing elevated venting with stone insulation techniques. Even young Eli Prowse, the boy who'd split his skull months before, had helped his father measure their cabin's underside, searching for places the cold had crept in last winter. Martha helped when asked, but she no longer had to lead. They had started leading each other, which perhaps was her greatest design of all. She spent most of that summer in silence, not because she was lonely, but because the silence was hers, a thing she had earned. She let it fill her like warm air rising through floorboards. Every now and then she would sit on her high porch, toes resting just above the grass tips swaying below, and look out at the changing ridge. She never forgot what they'd called her. Fool, touched, a woman with no man, and too many ideas. But now she watched men follow her sketches, watched families measure walls by her diagrams, watched homes rise from the earth with space beneath them, room for the wind, room for the melt, room for breath. They never named it after her, never made speeches, but that didn't matter, because the heat said everything. The next winter came early again. A storm in late October tested the new builds before they were fully sealed. Some failed, some cracked, but none collapsed. And everyone stayed warmer than the last. By November, the schoolteacher had published a small pamphlet, Raised Hearths, Designs for Winter Cabins in Frost-Burdened Valleys. Martha's name wasn't on it, but she'd been consulted for every diagram. And in the foreword, penned by the schoolteacher in a neat, tight hand, one sentence stood alone. The warmth of a home depends more on its foundation than its fire. Martha read that line once, then tucked the paper beneath her mattress. When the first deep freeze came, January 12th, 2 days earlier than predicted, there were no panicked rushes for wood, no children coughing blood, no smoke so thick it blotted out the church steeple. There was just calm. Frost clung to the trees, but not the homes. Heat stayed where it belonged. And still, in the highest cabin of all, Martha didn't stoke her stove for 3 days. She didn't need to. One day that winter, she awoke to find boot tracks circling her cabin. Not deep, not fast, careful. They led from the road, looped around the outer stilts, stopped by her stacked firewood, then returned the way they came. No damage, no threat, just curiosity. She never found out who it was, but she liked to think it was someone remembering what she'd done, wanting to see if it still worked. If it had held, it had. The town changed, slowly, naturally, but wholly. People stopped asking how high a cabin could be built. They started asking how high it should be. The general store carried pitch sealant by the barrel now. Wool was sold in rolls instead of bundles. The mill near Whitcomb's Creek added angled vent panels to their catalogue of frame parts. Martha's old enemies never apologized out loud, but they started looking her in the eye, and in a place like that it meant more than words ever could. One evening, late in the season, Peter Lowe brought a crate of preserved apples to her porch. He didn't knock, just left it there with a note pinned to the lid. "You taught us how not to freeze. Next winter we'll teach others. Thank you for warming more than just a home." She folded the note and kept it with the others. She had a drawer for them now, not because she needed the praise, but because every once in a while, When the wind howled hard enough to rattle the siding, she'd like to hold one of those notes and remember she'd been right, and she'd never needed to shout it. Years passed. The elevated stiles spread, first to Faircross, then west, down the trail to Ashdown Ridge. By the third winter, a small article appeared in a county engineering digest titled Uplifted Dwellings in Cold Terrain. It cited practical frontier innovation and one widow's curious design. Martha never saw that article, didn't care to. She'd already lived the truth. What mattered wasn't the credit. What mattered was the warmth, the way it stayed, the way it spread, and how, by lifting herself just 9 feet off the ground, she'd shown an entire town how to rise.